Greetings, people. Welcome to episode 2 in our series on building the ultimate pedal board. Today it's all about the pedals themselves, so we will get to this point. But we have a lot of stuff to talk about first. So we're going to talk about what pedals you might consider including in your pedal board build and why. We're going to talk about pedal board order, and we're also going to be talking about some ways of identifying problem areas that you should probably test exhaustively before you get going, just to make sure you don't get in trouble later. So anytime I'm thinking about making sounds and I'm interfacing guitars and gear, if I'm trying to make sounds that I'm recreating after hearing a record or something, there are a couple things to keep in mind. For one, what era was that record recorded in? For instance, if you're listening to a Jimi Hendrix record from the 60s, Jimmy's amps didn't have effects loops. So any of the 5 pedals that he basically had were always in front of the amp. If you're listening to something from the 80s or 90s, all bets are off. If you're listening to, vintage style players like Eric Johnson or even modern Mike Landau, those guys are pretty much amps and pedals. If you're listening to somebody modern like Matt Bellamy from Muse or The Edge or somebody, those guys are technologically advanced, and there's no way to know what the order is just from listening to the track. So keep the era in mind, and that'll at least start you off on the right foot. So in general, when you're thinking about interfacing gear and guitars, and you're trying to think about how to figure out where pedals go, it really comes down to the amount of distortion in the rig, whether that distortion is made by the amp's preamp or power amp, or by your distortion pedals that are actually in your rig. So in general, if you want something crunchy or compressed or a little dirty, it needs to be placed in front of the other stuff in your chain that makes those kinds of noises, the distortion pedal or the amp's preamp itself. If you want something to be more high fidelity and sort of less influenced by distortion, probably have it in the effects loop, or at the very least after the distortion producing pedals that you have in your rig. So for instance, if you have an amp that does not have an effects loop and all of your effects are going to be in front of that amp, you know that you have to set up that amp's preamp so that it can handle any sound that you'd want to get out of it. So if you've got long delays or reverbs on your pedal board going into one amp with no effects loop, you know that that amp can't be set to massive amounts of crunch, or else it's going to make your reverbs and delays sound really strange. So it all comes down to where the distortion sits in your rig and managing that. All right, so if we have a quick discussion on pedal order based upon effect type, we could start with overdrive and distortion, and 99.9% of the time, those pedals are placed in front of the amp's preamp. Sometimes you might hear people putting distortion pedals in the effects loop, but that would probably be a different use case in the sense that the amp's preamp, the gain staging, the tone stack that has the EQ in it, that is responsible for a lot of your guitar's sound. So if you put distortion after it, you're probably going for something else. And this is the point when I should say, if it sounds good to you, it's good. Like even if it wouldn't work for a country gig to put a gated distortion after a huge reverb, if it works for the music that you're making, do it. That's all that matters. What pleases you is what is technically correct. So if you talk about fuzz pedals, which are a subset of distortion, and I've called them out separately. The reason I've called them out separately is because they act a little different than distortion pedals traditionally do. If you look at a fuzz face variant, it really likes to be connected directly to a guitar's pickup, so that when you roll the volume knob back, it does completely different things. So if your fuzz doesn't have a buffer, it probably wants to be right the first thing in the chain. If your fuzz has a buffer, it can probably handle being in a couple different places, but in general, try it out early on in the chain first, because you will probably find that the closer it is to your guitar, the more happy it is, and which is one of the reasons why I modified a couple old wahs back in the day to be true bypass so that the wah could go first, fuzz could go later. Speaking of wah-wahs, they sound very different depending on where you place them in the chain. Lots of people put them first or second. And traditionally, that works really well. When you sweep through a wah, it changes the frequencies that get distorted. So it actually is a very distinctive sound and can sound very weird if it's placed in another part of the signal chain. It won't have as much effect, and the curve can feel like it's off. Sometimes if you put a wah in front of a fuzz, it sounds almost uninteresting and odd. So sometimes the fuzz goes first, then the wah happens. But in general, wah goes early on in the chain so that it can affect anything down further down the line with all of the mid-range sweeping that it's going to do. So compression, there are sort of two types of it in a way. If you want something that's effecty and sort of like a signature kind of a sound, like a Dynacomp or a Ross kind of a thing, traditionally those go in front early on in the signal chain, in front of the preamp. If you want something that's more like a studio kind of a compression kind of a scheme, in the studio, oftentimes we put that compressor after the mic preamp that's miking the speaker cabinet. So if you want to try to make that behavior work before it gets to the speaker cabinet, I would suggest putting that in the effects loop. But in general, if you want your guitar compression, kind of Dynacomp, little suck and blow kind of thing, put that early on in the chain. When it comes down to volume pedals, where the volume pedal is placed depends largely on how it behaves. So if you put a volume pedal in front of all of your distortion products, it's going to act just like your guitar volume knob. So the lower the volume is, the less distortion you get. So it depends on how you like running your rig. I know some guys that have a distortion or have a volume pedal in front of their rig, and that basically modifies the amount of distortion so they don't have to do the volume knob thing. And if you're like me, you have a completely different idea about that. For me, my volume pedal is my master volume, and it goes after any distortion pedals, but before my time-based effects. And that is so that I can swell finished distorted guitar sounds into delays and reverbs. And at that point, it means that basically the volume pedal is my master volume. So I can turn my volume down on the guitar to get a little less crunch, and then turn the amp up a little bit to make sure that it's still just as loud, but I don't have as much distortion. If I want to roll the guitar all the way on and then roll the volume pedal back a little bit to not have it be so loud, but it's still very distorted, I can do that. So the volume pedal, the behavior of it, depends largely of where it sits. So if you have an amp with an effects loop, for me, the volume pedal goes at the very beginning of the effects loop. And if you have a situation where you're using modeling, or you have an amp that doesn't have an effects loop, for me, the volume pedal goes after any distortion pedals, but before delay and reverb. When it comes to modulation effects, there are a number of different types that are often used with guitar. Phasers and univibes and trems and things like that often go in front of the amp so that they can catch a little bit of the character of the preamp. But there are others that guys often use after the preamp, after the main sound is made, like a Leslie simulator like our Lex, or a stereo chorus, for instance. When it comes to delays and echoes, in some ways, the length of the delay repeat can determine where it sits, because the longer the delay is, if it's really distorted, the more sort of out of control it gets, which can be really cool, but it can be hard to control if you're trying to control it. So, guys like my friend Osnoy always have a slapback echo going on at all times. That's kind of like his ambience that he uses. And that is in front of the amp's preamp, because the amp's preamp can help fatten up the sounds of those short repeats. And because they're really short, they don't get out of control. But if you take something like, a Memory Man or something that's doing all sorts of cool, modulated delays that are really long, you probably want those away from the distortion making elements in your rig so that those repeats can remain fairly pristine as they decay away. Otherwise, like I said, it gets into noise land, which can be awesome, but you have to plan for that and be able to control it. When it comes down to reverb, generally reverb goes at the very end. The very end, right before the end of the chain, basically. And that's because distorting a reverb can sound generally pretty gnarly. I'm not going to say awful, because there are some times that's exactly what you want. If you're doing industrial music or you're doing something where you've got distorted, gated reverbs, that kind of stuff, hey, that's cool. It won't work for a blues gig or a country gig, but it'll be awesome for the music that you're making. So in general, reverb goes at the end of the chain. When it comes down to specialty stuff like granular synths or pitch shifters or things like that, you need to think about the rest of the rig and how it's going to influence the behavior of that device. So if you take something like a pitch shifter, for instance, there are going to be times when I personally want to play a clean chord and have an octave up and have it be all clean and shimmery so that you can really hear it and be distinct. But there are other times when I'm going to want to be able to play a distorted riff with an octave down, but have the octave distorted too, so it's all powerful. In that case, the octave has to come in front of the distortion. So, in my rig, I'll be able to move any of that stuff anywhere I want, before or after any effect. That's fine. But in your case, if you can't do that, you need to think about the use cases for this device and how often you're going to need it to do all of the things that it does. So for instance, in these cases, it probably makes sense to have the pitch shifter early so that it can be distorted if you have your distortion pedals on, and it can be clean if you don't. When it comes down to what pedals to actually include in your build, in some ways, the task that you need the rig for is what should determine what's on it, if that makes sense. So if you're doing what I did for a long time, which is build a board for a session or for a gig or for a mini tour or something, make sure that you have everything on there that you're going to need. Don't get to the gig and then someone says, play the intro to Black Hole Sun, and you don't have a Leslie. Make sure that you've got those sounds so that you know what you're doing and you can cover everything that you need to do. In this situation, where this is my FOMO board, this is my fear of missing out workstation crazy thing, all bets are off. I can technically include whatever I want, and now I have to think about what amps I'm going to be interfacing with. So if you look at all the amps behind me, some of them are derived from, sort of Fender-y kind of designs, like the divided by 13 FTR 37 and that Bogner down there. Some are Marshall-centric, like the Friedmans and the drive channel to that Sur amp. Some are wacky, like that Guytron GT100 has two EL84s in the preamp. So it's basically like a Herzog into a Plexi, so that's wild. You'll hear that in a second, actually. So depending on what amps you're going to be using, it may change the kinds of pedals that you include on your board. Now, when it comes down to post effects, Big Sky, Timeline, Mobius, Volante, that kind of stuff that's on here, those work with any amp in the world because the guitar tone has largely been created by the time they're influencing things. They're making things longer and wider and fatter and bigger, but I already have my guitar sound, if that makes sense. This really matters when you start talking about the stuff that goes in front of the amp's preamp, and that is why I'm using 8 different drive pedals. Yeah, 8. So out of those 8, I should be able to stack together whatever I need to get great sounds out of any amp that I need to be able to interface with. So some of the amps don't like some of the stuff, some of the amps don't like other things, but there are enough things in that mix of pedals to be able to get whatever I need out of any of these amps. And the other thing to remember as well is if you notice, most of the stuff I've included on here is all dedicated effects. And that's because that's kind of the highest quality you can get, Big Sky MX is the ultimate reverb. I'm not going to find anything that sounds like that in any multi-effects unit. That's not going to happen. However, there are going to be times when you kind of do need that Swiss Army knife just for space. And that's why I've used the HX Stomp in here. So there may be times when Compadre is off on another board and I need a compressor. I can use HX Stomp for that. We don't actually do pitch shifting stuff like whammy things. So maybe I need a whammy or a pitch shifter, so I can use it for that. So basically I have everything dedicated to one kind of effect, basically, other than HX Stomp, which is my Swiss Army knife for this board. And that's basically how I came up with the gear complement. I needed to look at all the amps I'm going to be interfacing with, and I basically just needed to make sure that everything on here will do something great with all the stuff I'm going to be using it with. And that's how I did it. So before you get to the point where you're actually wiring your rig together and assembling it, I would suggest that you identify any critical pain points in the rig and test them exhaustively to make sure that you don't make a mistake and you don't get into trouble later on when it's really hard to change stuff. So, for me personally, I'm going to be making custom cables for this build. So I'm going to be making custom cables and cutting them to length. I need to make sure that once I get to that stage, all the choices I've made are the right choices, because it'll be really tough for me to change them later. So if you have a simple rig that's got wah, distortion, modulation, and delay or something like that, it's easy. Hook them all up in series and plug them into your amp and test them. In general, I would say that you should test the chain that goes in front of your amp, no matter what. So some pedals do not like following other pedals. Input impedance and output impedance and things like that are really important. So you need to test the pedals that you're going to be using in the order that you're going to be using them complete. With a wah, if you're going to use the wah, and a volume pedal, if you're going to use it, whatever. Make sure that you're testing your entire scenario so that when you get to the point where you're going to build it, there are no surprises. Now, for me personally, I'm going to be using a couple of these Morningstar ML10x units. That are the nerve center, the audio nerve center for the rig. So I've got two of these. I have one that goes in front of the preamp, and I have one that goes after the preamp in the effects loop. So the one that goes in front of the preamp is running in mono for 10 loops, and the one that is after in the effects loop is going to be running 5 loops in stereo when I need the stereo-ness. Otherwise, I'll just be listening to the left side, basically. But these are all buffered, which means that that's a critical issue for some of the distortion pedals I'm going to be using. So I built some pickup simulator circuits that Jack Orman designed into my interface box, and I'll talk about that when we get to the interface box section. But the main thing to realize is that to use all 10 loops in this thing, I got to use 10 Y cables, like TRS to TS Y cables. I didn't have 10 Y cables hanging around the house. So I had a few, but I ordered a couple more from Amazon to test them out, and they were all wired incorrectly for what I needed to do. So the other critical part of this is make sure that you use a multimeter and test all of your cables. Make sure that you don't think that you have a problem just because you have a bad cable, because with as complex as my scenario is, if I have a bad cable, I could be screwed. I could be so screwed. So I'm going to be testing all of my cables to make sure that they all work before actually plugging them in to test how they actually sound. So I've got, in the following section, I've got 8 drive pedals in the ML10X. I've got them all with a bunch of Y cables being controlled by an MC6 Pro, just on-offs. And what I'm really looking for is to make sure that there's no clicks and pops. I need to make sure that all the gain staging works right, that they stack properly, and that they're not excessively noisy, and that the pedals sound right. So I should say this. If you are OCD, if you have a problem seeing messy wiring, the following section might be very uncomfortable for you. So I should say the following segment might be uncomfortable for some viewers. All right, so here we are in our crazy wiring scenario. Don't worry, this is not permanent. I know it's really disgusting and crazy to look at the moment, but this is a means to an end. What we're really trying to do here is make sure that all 8 of these drive pedals work inside of the ML10X with all the crazy buffering that's going on. In order to be able to reorder the loops in the ML10X, every single loop is buffered. So that means that things like these fuzzes really hate that. So I've got 2 of Jack Orman's anti-buffer circuits built into this interface. So I need to make sure that those work with the fuzzes. I need to make sure that everybody stacks properly and doesn't add excessive noise, and that we can control everything that we want to. So what I've got going on the MC6 Pro is I have on-offs for each one of the individual loops, basically. So I turn one on, and that's a separate pedal. That's another pedal. You can turn on multiple ones at once. You go up, and there's another 3. So I got 8 total, and then I also have a flatten preset, which is basically just a way to turn off all the loops to make sure I get back to my clean tone if I get in trouble. So here is the ML10X. So you can see I've got 8 loops in there. They're all in series, and if I just hit buttons on the MC6 Pro, it turns them on and off. Octafuzz, Compadre, Chula, the idea. And if I get, too many on and get too much noise and I'm scaring myself, whatever, I just hit the flatten, whoop, and it turns all of them off no matter how many are on, which is really helpful. So the order is the Cletus Fuzz, buddy of mine built me, then the Octafuzz, then Compadre, then the Love Pedal Chula, then the RC Booster that's modified to have more bass, like the Henderson model, and then the Nordland ODR-CS. This is made by the same guy that designed the original Nobles circuit. So it's very, very cool. It's got a germanium circuit in it. It's pretty cool. After that, you get the classic SD9, and then after that, you get the Bogner Red pedal, which is awesome. So all this stuff works out really well. So what we can do now is just start testing them out to make sure that everything is working properly. So for this, we're going through my ancient Guytron GT100. Basically, it hasn't been serviced since the dawn of time. It is 100 watts, so it's going to hum a little bit, but it sounds great, and at the moment, it's going to do what we need it to do. It sounds great. I have a dig and a blue sky in the effects loop to give me a bit of schmutz, so that when we're playing it, it's not just bone dry. And then, so here we are. There's a little bit of drive on the clean channel, just to give it a little bit of compression, but so you can see it sounds really nice. So we have Cletus. And it rolls off really nicely. So we test the buffer, the anti-buffer circuit, to make sure that it rolls off. And it does. And then here's the Octafuzz without the octave. And its anti-buffer circuit. Works great. Compressor for Compadre. Works great. Now, I normally use the Chula to stack, but it's working really nicely here by itself. Works. And then the RC Booster, I've got it on pretty fat because I love the bass out of it. Now if you go up, you get the ODR-CS, which I've got at, not so much gain on it, but it does some really neat stuff. And then you have the SD9 for that Henderson Landau thing. Fun. And then you have the Bogner Red, which is just awesome. Now as you start stacking, let's say you go back down, say take Compadre and stack it with the ODR. Now you have this really nice sort of pop lead sound. you want to, you can take the compressor out via MIDI, use the boost on Compadre instead, and get a little bit more Gnarlesville. Whatever. Let's see, you could do what I do all the time, which is the Chula and the RC together. So you get the idea. All of the pedals are working properly in the loops. The anti-buffer circuits are working. Everything is working. There's no excessive noise. So I can be confident that when I wire all of the custom cables I'm going to need to make this not look like this, that we're all good. So onward and upward. Woohoo! Test completed successfully. Okay, so now I'm excited. That sounds good. I want to get it done now. So I was using the Tausch, which has really loud pickups and smaller strings. I picked up the Strat, which is my normal guitar, which has 12s on it and lower output pickups. And it sounds completely different. Like still cool and absolutely killer, but in a completely different way. So it's exciting. It's an indicator that, you know, even if I pick up a different guitar with a completely different sonic signature to it, this rig is going to work awesome. So I'm super excited. In episode 3 coming up, we're going to cover hardware interface design, audio snake design, and how switches work and stuff like that. So stick around. We're getting there. Cheers.